We'll share the recording and slide deck with you after the fact. So welcome, everyone. Just a few housekeeping issues. If you could leave your phone on mute while you're on the call. We'll open it up for questions and answers later, but that'll ensure we can hear Mike with no distractions. So please put your phones on mute. So let's get going. It's going to be a lot of stuff to cover today. If you could just put your phones on mute, that would be appreciated. So
Somebody
our
wants to
presenter today, like maybe I can mute people, but I think you can after Mike as well. All right, folks. Once again, I hear a woman's voice. Someone not unmute.
She's asking for a Boston cream donut. I can tell.
Okay. Let me see if I can mute them.
Did you just X out of the meeting?
All right. I think I found the mic. Very good.
Right,
let's get going.
When you are, give me control or whatever you need to do.
I will. So today, let me pass the presenter role to Mike Lannan. So once again, our odor control specialist and NEBRA board member, Mike Lannan, will be presenting today. Let me just tell you a little bit about Mike. He's a licensed professional engineer. He has a BS in chemical engineering and an MS in environmental engineering from Northeastern. And we're going to be seeing his screen in a moment. Mike began his career, Mike began his career with CDM Smith back when it was Camp Dresser McGee. He worked for them for 10 years. And then he's been with Tech Environmental since 2002. And Tech Environmental began in 1984 by training regulators. And since its founding, it's trained thousands of regulators all across the country, but Maine, New Jersey, New Hampshire, New York, Rhode Island, New Jersey have all benefited from Tech Environmental's expertise. Again, NEBRA is very lucky to have Mike as a member of our board and his odor expertise available to all of you members here today. So with that, Mike, you can take over from here.
Great. Can you see my screen?
Yes, I can. Folks might just need to blow that up a little.
Okay, whatever you need to do. I'm just going with the slideshow. I can't see anybody else at this point, but that's fine. So this is the second module on our odor series here. You just talked a little bit about what we've done historically, and we began by training regulators on air quality modeling back in the late 70s and early 80s. Our founder was one helping EPA with that. So we've sort of continued with that training of regulators, operators, and industry consultants for many years, and have done it throughout many states and also locally. So this one is sort of on odor limits. What do they mean? And this is actually going to be sort of a two-parter. We'll get through the first half today, and on the next one, we'll finish it up, mostly because of time. We want to get it through during the lunch hour and so on. So to recap where we were last time, we talked about the sense of smell in the brain. What is odor? Essentially, it's a reaction, not a physical thing. That's the gist of that. We talked a little bit about the odor detection threshold and the odor recognition threshold and how they are different. And then we talked about normal smell and how it is not normal or one set thing. We did a little bit of an intro to the coronavirus and smell, and we talked about our dog Fido. Part of the recap is the odor detection threshold is the point where odor perception is just barely noticeable. It's really too faint to be recognized. Typically remains constant over time for mild odors, can become non-existent for stronger odors that that cause olfactory fatigue. And the recognition threshold is where we actually can tell that we are smelling something, and we might know what it is if we have sort of a card catalog in our brain of that particular odor from past experiences. The key here is one thing to note is as people are impacted by odor, over time, the RT, the recognition threshold, will become closer to the DT as we teach ourselves this. Olfaction varies from person to person. 1 in 20 lie outside of the normal range. We had shown this figure last time to talk about those that are hypersensitive and desensitized. And we talked a little bit about how the coronavirus is affecting our sense of smell. Last time we talked about damage to the neuropathways and also the potential for inflammation. The newest info on that now is that the studies now show that at least 34% and really up to about 98% of hospitalized patients do have some sort of reduction in smell, and they're actually using it somewhat as an indicator to help people understand whether they might have it or not, as opposed to the regular flu. That might become more interesting as we head into the normal flu season this year. The good news is the recent work shows that it's not affecting the neurons as much as they thought, but the supporting cells, and the supporting cells regenerate, so that's a good thing. 27 times more likely to lose the sense of smell from gas in the coronavirus than under normal circumstances. A few thoughts about this 27 times more likely scenario is it is an immediate loss, which is unusual. Most loss of smell is much slower over time, either from exposure or age. The majority, therefore, regain it, but there are very little numerical stats available on that at this time, and that's likely because what is it when it's back? I was reading this article from a chef who said he's back to the point where he can smell garlic and so on, but he still has to have other people decide whether the milk is bad or not. So he feels like he's regained it, but not 100%. So that's one of those things of how much is where's the threshold. The other interesting thing is that they are starting to retrain some people that have lost their sense of smell but have recovered from the coronavirus. Think of it sort of as physical therapy for the nose. And, as we talked about with the DT and the RT, we train ourselves whether we like it or not for malodors. We could also train ourselves to smell again with respect to the coronavirus. The other thing we talked about was the nuisance combinations, our dog Fido frequency, intensity, duration, and offensiveness. All those factors play into odors, and we'll think about that a little bit later when we talk about specific odor thresholds for different states for hydrogen sulfide. Just sort of graphically, if you're looking at this chart, this is showing that the more intense on the Y scale versus the number of times that occurs on the X scale, as you are exposed more and more times or for longer periods of time, the intensity can go down where you really sort of start to become concerned about nuisance thresholds. So, odor limits, what do they mean? Well, when I'm talking about odor limits in these slides, I'm really talking about a synonym for odor regulations. It's a longer phrase, and it's just shorter and quicker to talk about odor limits. And those limits can be rules, laws, rules of thumb, and so on. So if odor is a reaction to the stimulation of the olfactory system, remember, not an actual thing itself, and olfactory stimulation is different for different individuals. should odor limits be fixed numerical thresholds, or should they be based upon an adverse human reaction? And that's sort of been the discussion of not just odor nuisances, really, but all nuisances associated with our senses, dust, visual, noise, vibration, and so on. So I guess, to get started, I guess the question is, where do we start? The goal is to prevent adverse conditions. So is the approach to simply say, the next commandment will be, thou shalt not create a nuisance? It seems simple enough. I mean, that's really the goal, is we don't want to create nuisances. But before we start thinking about that, we should really, I think, a little bit more about what exactly do we mean when we say a nuisance, because a nuisance has many definitions. The sort of simple definition, the Merriam-Webster dictionary definition, is one of either harm or injury, or two, one that is annoying, unpleasant, or obnoxious, sort of a pest. Synonyms for nuisance would be annoyance, annoy or bother, gadfly, and some others here. The important thing here is you'll notice most or many of the synonyms are really sort of related to the second part, because I think most people think of a nuisance as being annoying or unpleasant or obnoxious, sort of the simple nuisance definition. Now, the legal definition is one that we often get into as we start looking at different regulations in state and locally. Nuisance is the unreasonable, unwarranted, and or unlawful use of property which causes inconvenience or damage to others, either to individuals and or to the general public. Now, when we start talking about legal nuisances, we often talk about public versus private nuisance in nuisance law. And we focused a little bit last time more on sort of the human body and so on. And this one's a little bit more related to sort of legalese to some extent, because it's important to discuss what the goals are before we start looking at why there are different limits, why states have different limits, why they approach odor either generally or with actual limits. So private and public nuisances are distinct torts. They are quite unrelated, except in the vague general way that each of them causes inconveniences to someone. And the two obviously share the common nuisance name. I think most people sort of think of public versus private as sort of holistic or individual based, and to some extent that is what it is. But without getting deep into the legalese of it, they came about down two very different pathways from all the cases that resulted in this. But generally speaking, public nuisances and private nuisance are based on two really fundamentally different principles. A private nuisance is a civil wrong based on disturbances of a plaintiff's right in his land, okay? And a public nuisance is not dependent on the disturbance of the rights of the land, but rather upon an interference with the rights of the community at large. Public nuisances do not necessarily involve or interfere with private enjoyment or private property, rather interfere with the public's right to public health, safety, or inconvenience or annoyance to the public. So when you look at those words, And then we look at sort of the odor regulations for the state of New York from 1974. It says pollution prohibited. Air pollution is the presence of an air contaminant, including odor, which unreasonably interferes with the comfortable enjoyment of life and property. So most commandment-style rules like this were originally designed to prevent public nuisances. The problem with these rules are it's nearly impossible for any facility to know what is required to meet those limits, and it really does not define the expectations for the neighbors. Again, this gets us back to what we had talked about at the first one on the science of odor is the public generally feels that there is such a thing as no odor, and no odor is no reaction from a human. So we react to odors everywhere. Wherever you are right now, you probably are. Whoever was trying to get Boston cream donuts is probably reacting to that odor earlier too. So we're constantly being hit by odors. So when people say they expect no odor, what they're really saying is they expect a malodor to not be either dominating the odor to the point where it's an annoyance, or really is it the most obvious odor present? In other words, if the smell of fresh grass is out there, but all you can smell is a landfill, then that's what people then generally feel of as or what is necessary to limit sort of public nuisances. Most commandment-style rules today, after some of the larger legal cases that were settled in the 70s, are designed to prevent public and private nuisances. Unfortunately, they still have the same where are the goalposts problems. So I'm going to go through a few examples here. There are obviously many, many examples, but I'll start with the current Massachusetts odor regulation. It comes from the 310 CMR 7, and it talks about odor, dust and odor in particular. And I've taken out the stuff related to dust and just focusing on the odor part. No person having control of any odor-generating operations shall permit emissions therefrom which cause or contribute to a condition of air pollution. Okay, so you can't cause air pollution. So what this is doing now is we've taken sort of the general nuisance, public nuisance, and now we've incorporated the private nuisance concerns because we're defining it as air pollution. But obviously, to define it as air pollution, we probably need to know what Massachusetts defines air pollution as. Well, in the definitions of 310 CMR 7, air pollution means the presence in the ambient airspace of one or more air contaminants or combinations thereof in such concentrations and of such duration as to cause a nuisance is the first one. And I just like to point out that nuisance in the air regs has no formal definition, again, because that's starting to get into the nuances of legalese. But the intent here is for the public nuisance aspect of it in that one. And then we have our B and C of this definition, where it would be injurious or on the basis of current information, potentially injurious to human or animal life, to vegetation, or to property. So again, here with the property and possibly impact to someone's yard, someone's pets, someone themselves. We're starting to pull the private aspects of nuisance concerns into the discussion, and then unreasonably interferes with the comfortable enjoyment of life, property, or the conduct of business. So again, that's more of a public nuisance type of discussion, but that could be applied on an individual basis. And again, I'm not going to get into the legalese of this. I read this stuff for fun, but you guys probably won't enjoy it. So, but the point there is that there is also a member of a private member of a community can actually bring a public nuisance suit themselves if they have been personally harmed. But we won't get into that anymore. But obviously, to talk about this, then we need to talk about, well, what is an air contaminant? Well, an air contaminant means a substance or man-made physical phenomenon in the ambient airspace, and it includes blah, blah, blah. Odor is one of them, and any combination thereof. So in Massachusetts, they physically define the air contaminant as odor. And again, we've talked about odor not being a physical thing, but it really, when they say odor here, they mean odorant. But it actually is incorporated. Many states do not actually put the word odor in there, but they use the general nuisance type of descriptors, which I'll show an example of in a little bit, to get there. And then Massachusetts also actually does define odor. And again, many states don't necessarily define it, but it is helpful if possible. So odor means that property of gaseous, liquid, or solid materials that elicits a physiological response by the human sense of smell. So that's very similar to what we had talked about last time with the science of odor a little bit. It's the properties that get into our nose and actually cause us to react, which is the odor. Here's New York City. So this is now not a state standard, but this is sort of a New York City air pollution control declaration of policy. So it's the public policy of the city that every person is entitled to air that is not detrimental to life, health, and the enjoyment of his or her property. It is hereby declared, whenever we hear stuff like that, we're always thinking about public nuisances more so than private. It is hereby declared that the emission into the open air of any harmful or objectionable substance, including but not limited to smoke, soot, fly ash, dust fumes, gas vapors, odors, or any products or combinations, blah, 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 of fuel burning equipment, is a menace to the health, welfare, and comfort of the people of the city. And, so that was public, now we're going to pull in the private, and cause of extensive damage to property. For the purpose of controlling and reducing air pollution, it is hereby declared to be the policy of the city to actively regulate and eliminate such emissions, and it goes on with some other stuff, but that's the important part for us. But the interesting thing here is that in the first part here, I just went back for a second, they talk about harmful or objectionable substances. And I think that's one of the factors or one of the words that's often used to try to tie the things together with nuisances with respect to odor. Is it objectionable? Because just because I smell something, just because I see a billboard that isn't pleasing to me, does not mean it's not objectionable. That said, we're in the politics season now, and maybe if you saw something by one candidate, you might find it objectionable. But the point is that just the sensation of your senses is not the objectionable part. There needs to be something that's sort of overwhelming there. So when we talk about odor regulations, we can talk about numerical odor limits, and those can be pollutant specific, which is sort of the focus of today's 1 hour thing. They can be total odor, which we'll get into a little bit more next time. And then they can also be sort of the odor nuisance exceedances, basically based on complaints. We have one client where we review all of the projects proposed for nuisance determinations for a facility as part of their initial permitting process. However, their regulations don't require that they meet certain limits. They actually just require that they don't have complaints. And the interesting thing in that regard is, in that particular instance, those complaints are related to confirmed complaints. But there's also regulations that are sometimes just based on a certain number of complaints by either multiple individuals or multiple times by one individual or a combination thereof. So that's another way, and we'll talk a little bit more about those type of regulations next time as well. Because I think for today, I think one of the interesting things, the second one, the second one here, the total odor, and then the complaint-based is a much broader discussion, and it's something that's a little bit different from the way we sort of normally think of regulations. Most of the time, we think of them more on a pollutant-specific basis. So I thought it made sense to talk about it that way initially. So when we look at odor regulations, often we look at hydrogen sulfide as a surrogate for total odor, for field verification. Obviously, sometimes this works and sometimes it doesn't. As we know with wastewater plants, most of the traditional wastewater or interceptor type of odors have dissolved sulfides, which in certain pHs will become hydrogen sulfide. When we look at landfills, we have the potential for hydrogen sulfide, but we also have the potential for mercaptans. And even though in landfills, mercaptans are emitted at a lower rate than hydrogen sulfide, the odor detection threshold is on the order of 2 to 3 orders of magnitude lower. And there's a range there, and I'll get into that in a second. But because there's a range, if we're going to use H2S as a trigger, for most sources, that's probably a pretty good surrogate, not just because it's present, but also it's something that we can measure at low levels, independent of other compounds. So it's a nice one to measure, to focus on. But if we're going to do that, then okay, what should the odor limit be? If we're going to use hydrogen sulfide as a surrogate for odor, what should the limit be? Okay, well, what is the odor limit for hydrogen sulfide? Well, unfortunately, odor detection thresholds are highly dependent on how and why they were developed. There are a number of reference sources for different odorants, and it really comes down to how were they determined, and that can be done on was it done by bubbling air through a liquid? Was it done by an air method of presentation to the panelists? And but even more so, like what was the goal? Okay, so just as an example, here I'm showing 3 separate odor character wheels. The one in the bottom left is and you're not expected to be able to read these, they're just visually. But the bottom left is a whiskey wheel, and that's one where someone who was in the whiskey industry would be using this wheel to sort of describe the character. Well, along with that, they would often be asked, people that are trained to examine whiskey for consistency, for new product development, and so on, would be asked what they thought the strength was. And then they would also try to look in the laboratory to try to determine what the strength is. They have very different goals than the one in the middle, which is sort of an odor wheel for a composting facility. So the intent of the odor wheel for this composting facility is, if you could find the odor character on this wheel, it's very likely that you can help determine the source on the site, or what's wrong with the particular process that might be driving up odors. The person that would be establishing odor thresholds for this type of a wheel would be coming at it entirely different. The person from the whiskey group, or the one on the right, which is wine, the people from the whiskey and the wine are coming at this from the point of view of the fragrances are generally favorable and desirable, and the way that they add the air in determining the odor thresholds is very different than when people are looking at it from a malodor standpoint. So depending on how people are establishing these odor thresholds for detection, the actual detection range is going to vary. So when we go back to hydrogen sulfide, okay, it's the simplest reduced sulfur compound. It has no carbon in it at all. It's just hydrogen, 2 hydrogens and a sulfur. It's very reactive. It's heavier than air. It's a common odorant. It's been studied up, down, round and round. But the bottom line is still there's no definitive definition of the detection level. I would say, from my experience, that the detection level is around or somewhat in between about 0.5 part per billion to 10 parts per billion. And I think this is one of those things where when you see it, you know it. At 10 parts per billion, it is a readily detectable threshold. At 0.5 part per billion, you might just have some of the people on that sensitivity curve at the high end being able to detect it. But the important thing here is that because we have this range here of expectations of detection thresholds, that's just another factor that's added in when we start looking at odor thresholds for hydrogen sulfide as a surrogate for total odor. So what do we have for standards? Well, the U.S. has some federal standards. We have NIOSH, which is a 10-hour ceiling limit. We have OSHA, which is also a ceiling limit. And these are in ppb or 10 ppm, 20 ppm. And then there's an acute number for exposure of 200 ppb. And then I want to say it was maybe 5 years ago or so, the EPA came out with this IRIS number of 1.4 ppb. And that's chronic exposure over a lifetime. And when that first came out, it was problematic for many of our clients because if you were doing field monitoring with the gerometer, which you can get down into the single-digit part per billion levels, especially the newest one, the levels are actually more believable. You could actually have an instantaneous reading in 2, 3, 4, 5 ppb, and unfortunately, when this number came out, there was a lot of talk about, well, then, I'm being exposed at higher than the IRIS number. But this is an average over the lifetime, and we won't get into the health discussions today in the interest of time on how some of these are developed. But it comes from the 30 ppb 1 hour number that's been brought down to this number for lifetime exposure. But, so right here we have a huge range of limits for different reasons. The New York State DEC odor regulations, I'm sorry, that should be New York City, excuse me. That should be New York City DEP odor regulations. Has a standard of, I'm sorry, excuse me. This is actually the New York State air quality standard. Shall not exceed 0.01 ppm. So essentially 10 ppb. So they've decided that that's the threshold that they're going to go with. And the interesting thing here is now, this is an average concentration over a 1 hour period. The question of exposure time, when we get back to FIDO and concerns, obviously, the shorter the time frame, the more likely the number is an odor-related number, and the longer the time frame, the more likely that it is a long-term sort of or a chronic health concern number. That said, some of the shorter numbers are also health numbers. I'm sorry I got this confused with the New York City one, because the New York City one is actually 0.001 ppm or 1 ppb, and that is an odor number, which we'll talk about a little bit in a minute. So in some states, there are separate health and odor limits for hydrogen sulfide, for example. Texas is a good one. There is a 70 ppb 8-hour health number. And then there's also a 1 ppb 8-hour threshold for odor. Why would they have two numbers? Well, that is because the 70 ppb 8-hour is based on that 30 ppb. There's a study done where 30 ppb 1 hour health number that can be extrapolated to different time frames. And they want to distinguish between the two because back to the IRIS example I used a few minutes ago, in that particular case, we have people that are concerned about a few parts per billion or even above 10 parts per billion, where it's clearly the odor is present and known. Is that then a health concern? Well, Texas has decided that they want people to know that it would have to be 70 for 8 hours for that to be a concern. But other states have combined the two together. And Massachusetts is sort of the other end of that example, where there's a 0.65 ppb limit for 24 hours and a 0.65 ppb annual limit. And I have gone back and forth with the regulators on this one many, many times, and everybody has agreed that it doesn't make sense that there would be these two health numbers, because these are health-based standards in Mass. They don't have specific odor ones. They only have health ones. And why would you have the same number for 24 hours that you'd have for annual? And the reason for that has been explained to me is that they think the 0.5 ppb 24-hour number should be higher from a health reason, but keep it this way because it's also used for odor. And that is somewhat misleading, and I do not think that's good policy, but that's something that is just, I don't think the politics can raise numbers that easily. The idea would be to define it differently, but I've tried that a number of times, and there are only so many things you can do in life, and that's probably not going to change anytime soon. Whenever we're talking about H2S, I always love to talk about the toxic thresholds. again, that gets us back to the OSHA numbers that we talked about before. At 10 ppm, so again, this is 10,000 ppb, we start to get eye irritation. There's a point where we start to lose our sense of smell from this, and we can no longer smell it. But again, these numbers are way significantly higher than the odor numbers. But there are toxic concerns that we must consider with hydrogen sulfide, but we shouldn't get them confused with the other numbers that are health numbers that are not for toxic concerns, but for individual acute and chronic issues. Again, when we're talking about H2S thresholds and how they get combined together, we need to go back to our dog Fido. Specifically with regulations, we're looking at mostly what is the intensity, what is the limit for concentration, and how long is that concentration before it becomes an issue. And we don't really consider frequency in general terms, although I had worked with the state of Maine's solid waste division when they were looking at draft regulations for that were caused through legislation by a particular facility. In that case, we did actually talk about there being levels of concentrations based on the number of complaints, because they wanted it to be more dynamic. Those draft regulations were never finalized, which is often the case in these things. But the key here is again gets us back to the chart of the relationships between frequency, intensity, and duration, and so on. It's a sort of a three-dimensional discussion. And when you start considering those things, that's when you have different states with different ideas, with different needs, come up with different standards. So here are some examples of different standards. And, they're not necessarily labeled here as being odor or health standards for these odor limits. But you can kind of tell what their goals are based upon the durations. So, for example, here in Connecticut, we have a 15-minute 4.5 ppb number. That is anytime you see something that's usually an hour or less, or definitely less than an hour, it's almost always strictly an odor-related limit. Conversely, when you see such as Rhode Island or New Hampshire's annual numbers, those are traditionally not odor-related, but more along the health limit numbers. So, we have Vermont here, which has a 24-hour number of 23.8. North Carolina, 86 for 24 hours, substantially more than Vermont. And why that is, we could get into if we were doing a full-day seminar, but generally speaking, it has to do with the levels of conservatism built into it and also the state's needs. North Carolina has quite a few farms, chicken farms in particular, and they have traditionally had higher levels. Iowa is another place that has higher levels because of farming and so on. So, individual states' needs and the tolerance for odor in those states. We talked about tolerance last time. The tolerance helps drive these regulations as well. We have a lot of the states like Rhode Island have the 30 ppb 1 hour. That was all based on one health study. So a 1 hour 30 ppb, although it's short in the sense that it's 1 hour, it's often a health-based number, again, because if the odor detection level is 0.5 to 10 in that range, 30 is significantly more than that. When we look at Pennsylvania, we have 100 ppb 1 hour number. Again, obviously that was established specifically for concerns related to exposure for odor and health, mostly health, I'm sorry. Then we look at California. They've adopted that similar number. I talked about Massachusetts and Texas. In New York, we talked about the 10 ppb, 14 micrograms per meter cube, 1 hour number. And then they've adopted the sort of the 1.4 lifetime exposure as their annual number. And then New York City has that 1 ppb number. And that's clearly the odor one, and then New Jersey again has that air quality number. So there seems to be no consensus on a limit of what it should be. So really, what's the point of this? Well, although numerical limits seem devoid of public or private nuisance discussions, they are extremely interrelated. The numbers are based upon what people think might be considered a public nuisance or what might be a private nuisance to certain individuals. I'm working on the development of a new landfill in some southeastern states, and we are working on right now defining the tolerance for odor and what the public nuisance threshold would be, so that everybody that could go into the original host agreement, so everybody is sort of understanding it up front. So it's kind of good to have these limits, if you can, numerical ones built in. Maine, for example, has historically had very little desire to establish numerical limits or really define what an odor concern is. And why is that? Well, Maine for a long period of time was the home to many different paper mills, and there's often a joke that in Maine, when you pull into a mill town, that's the smell of money. That's the number one job source. The tolerance for odor in those areas were much higher. It was really hard for the state, when we were looking at those limits for that solid waste issue that the legislature had passed, to even consider sort of numerical limits, because they did feel that it was much more of a local tolerance issue, because clearly these paper mills had levels that were well above most of the limits shown on that place at times, but it was acceptable in those areas. Another example would be I've worked with the folks that make the little Keurig coffee cups there. The folks, what's their names? Green Mountain Coffee. And the smell of coffee odor in their hometown in Waterbury, Vermont is very strong. But as their patent was running out, they decided they wanted to start mass producing them around the country to get ahead of the game a little bit before they had too much competition. So they started to propose facilities throughout the country, and what they learned right away was that the tolerance for their coffee odor in other areas was not the same as it was in Waterbury. So we had to sort of negotiate on a state-by-state basis what level of odor control they would need to put in a plant in that place, and that was sort of worked into the due diligence of it. So that the point of this is okay to have different numbers. The limits should be based on state or local needs and not a one-size-fits-all approach. Odor limits are a fair and balanced way to establish expectations for all. So having odor limits, really, I think it puts the goalposts where they should be, at least so people know that there are goalposts. I think that's an important factor when we start talking about odor odor limits, odor regulations, and the potential for odor nuisances. Should the limits be pollutant specific, such as the H2S limits we discussed today? Should they be total odor based, or should they be complaint based? In other words, should we even regulate somebody until there's a problem? If they don't have a problem, then maybe we don't have to. That can be natural selection for individual local limits. Using the example of the paper mill towns, they didn't get complaints. So even though the levels were high, it was kind of a complaint-based program. They were allowed to have sort of higher limits than what would be acceptable in other places. But we'll talk a little bit more about total odor limits and complaint-based in the next session, because we have about 5 minutes left. Just to whet your appetite a little, here are some of the states that actually have DT odor limits. And more recently, we have some cities and towns that have started to discuss individual local odor limits. And interesting, most of the towns here that you can see, the coastal towns here and Denver as well, established these local limits mostly because of the marijuana industry. And these are all new limits that are coming into play, because how much marijuana odor can you have from your production facility and or your consumption of it, because it's clearly detectable beyond their fence line. So people are working on that too. And we'll talk a little bit more about where those are and so on. And I'll update this chart for next time. But this discussion of odor complaint-based regulations and whether or not there should be limits on total odor and this and that, they go back some time. Gregory Leonardos was one of the pioneers in odor assessments. He worked, what was the name of the company? Arthur D. Little, I think. started in the late 50s, 60s. He passed away in 2016, but here he is in 1974 talking about different regulations in Iowa, St. Louis, Omaha. Are complaints required for the regulations to kick in? What is the objectionable criteria? Should it be objectionable to 30% or more than 30 people? So that's sort of a public impact sort of criteria. How are you going to measure this? Centometer and stuff. We'll talk about that a little bit more next time as well. And then, what are the ambient limits? Well, for example, here in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, they had a residential limit of 4 DT for residential and 20 DT for industrial. In other areas were 8. So, this discussion has been going on for some time. And, I'll just end this here because we're about out of time for today. But, at the end of the first presentation on the science of odor, I asked the question, what will mitigate a nuisance? And I showed this example of this facility here in Stonington, Connecticut. And, now knowing what we know now, what would mitigate an odor nuisance here? What was required politically based on the numbers we just looked in the chart probably weren't necessary to meet the odor limit. So having an odor limit here that was used instead of the political solution might have saved this facility some money. So I just thought I'd throw this in again and talk about it each time as it relates to the actual subject for that day. So I want to thank you all, and if there are any questions, I'll take some, but otherwise the hour's about up, and I hope you enjoyed your lunchtime presentation, and we'll do it again sometime. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. I don't know if we have any time for questions today, but why don't you folks save them up and bring them with you to the next session which will be coming up in September. I want to again thank Mike, thank Tech Environmental for sharing all your expertise with us today, and thank everyone for joining us. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks.